December 2, 1944, Camp Trinidad, Colorado, 500 hours. The wind knifed down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, dragging the cold with it like a blade. Frost creaked in the barbed wire as if even steel couldn't stand still. And standing in a line outside the mess hall, wrapped in threadbare wool coats issued 3 weeks too late, stood 86 captured men of the Wehrmacht. Hungry, shivering, silent. Corporal Emil Becker hadn't spoken since sunrise the day before. Not when the American sergeant told them they'd be getting hot cakes and eggs, whatever those were. Not when the old farmer from Kansas who worked kitchen detail waved and called out, "Mornin', fellas," like they were hotel guests. Not even when Emil had spotted something impossible, something that had broken a part of him he didn't know was there to be broken. A man shuffling, wrapped in a patchwork coat made of stitched-together army blankets, hair long and gray like a prophet, eyes hollow with sleep and age. A tin cup in his hand rattling coins. The Americans didn't push him away. They gave him coffee. One soldier gave him a piece of bread, and he sat, right there on the base. No uniform, no purpose, just there, as if that was allowed. The man had smiled. Emil had spent 3 years in uniform, watched friends freeze to death in the Soviet snows for lack of a wool sock, seen his commanding officer court-martial a boy for falling asleep on guard duty because the cold had shut his body down. That boy, a conscript from Munich, was executed for sleeping. And here in America, they were giving bread to beggars. The smell hit him next. Sweet, fatty, warm, his brain whispered bacon, but the memory couldn't be trusted. Then something like syrup, sugar, real sugar. His stomach growled loud enough to make the man behind him shift awkwardly. "Next," barked the American sergeant with a southern drawl as thick as motor oil. But he wasn't cruel, that was the worst part. None of them were. They didn't bark with spit-flecked rage. They didn't strike men for not standing straight enough. They didn't make them chant oaths or march in icy mud. They served food, 3 meals a day, clockwork, and they said please. Inside the mess hall, Emil blinked against the light. Wood-paneled walls, posters with slogans, "Don't waste bread, remember the troops." A clean camp is a healthy camp. Behind the serving counter, steam hissed from metal trays. Men in aprons, not soldiers, smiled as they scooped food. Not slop, not broth with floating bone fragments. Actual food. 2 fried eggs, yellow and round as sunrise. A thick stack of pancakes, real butter. And yes, bacon, 2 sizzling strips crackling on his tray. He looked down at it like it might vanish, like it was a trap. The cook laughed. "You ain't in Berlin no more, buddy," he said, tapping Emil's tray. "Eat up before it gets cold." Emil sat, slowly, fork trembling in his hand. He wasn't the only one. Across the room, other Germans stared at their trays, eyes flicking from food to ceiling to door. A few began eating, carefully, politely. Others just sat and tried to understand what was happening. What was this country? They'd expected punishment, re-education, labor in coal mines like the Russians did, or starvation, maybe even execution. What they got was civilization, comfort. Not luxury, but more than any of them had ever known during wartime. And most troubling of all, they weren't the lowest on the American ladder. The beggar haunted Emil's thoughts as he chewed bacon for the first time in 4 years. Later that morning, they were marched, not barked, to the work detail depot, where trucks would take them into town. Half were assigned to the local railroad depot, the other half to municipal cleanup. Emil was in the second group. The truck rattled down a gravel road for 15 minutes before reaching Trinidad proper, and that was when he saw them again. More of them, on corners, near the rail yard, wrapped in newspaper, huddled in alleys, American civilians, ragged, toothless, some clearly drunk, and yet not invisible, not hunted. At a stoplight, Emil saw a shopkeeper walk out and hand a steaming cup to a man in a wheelchair. The man took it with shaking hands, and smiled. The shopkeeper smiled back. A moment later, 2 police officers strolled past without a word. "Those are your soldiers," Emil muttered in German. The POW beside him, a Bavarian truck mechanic named France, shook his head. No uniform, not soldiers. But they're here on the street. They've lost everything, and still, they're not treated like vermin. That afternoon, Emil was given a broom. No rifle, no watchtower guard screaming at him. He swept the sidewalk outside the post office. The local mail clerk, a man in a brown vest and cowboy hat, brought him a lemonade and said, "You boys do good work. Thank you kindly." France, sweeping across the street, just stared. They weren't allowed to speak to civilians officially, but the locals didn't seem to care. One old woman offered them biscuits. Another handed France a canteen of water. A teenager on a bicycle asked if they were from Germany, and when France nodded, the boy said, "My uncle's fighting in France. Don't worry, war'll be over soon. You'll go home." It didn't feel like war. It didn't feel like prison. And that night back at camp, when Emil finally summoned the nerve to ask Sergeant Whitaker, the man in charge of the work detail, about the homeless man he'd seen earlier, the answer came gently. "That's Clarence. Been livin' on the road since Hoover was president. Bit off in the head, but good soul. We try to keep him warm when we can. Give him a bite now and then. Can't just throw a man away." Emil stared at the sergeant. "You treat beggars better than our officers treated wounded men." Sergeant Whitaker looked him in the eye and said, "Son, this country don't always get it right, but we try real damn hard not to forget a man's still a man, no matter how low he's fallen." Emil didn't sleep that night. The bunk was warm, the air still, but his mind raced. For 3 years he had truly believed that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, and that America was the wild, decadent frontier. Now, inside a POW camp, after scrubbing toilets and sweeping streets, he was beginning to doubt everything he thought he knew about power, honor, and dignity. And he wasn't alone. France whispered across the bunk that night, "Do you think it's like this everywhere here?" Emil didn't answer, because he wasn't sure what would hurt more, knowing this was rare, or realizing it was normal. December 3, 1944, Camp Trinidad, Colorado, 4:30 hours. The barracks creaked in the wind again, but the smell was different. Not frost, not gun oil, not wet wool coffee. Somewhere someone had already started brewing it, and the rich, bitter scent floated between the thin wood slats like a ghost of a cafe. Emil Becker blinked awake in the dark, confused. It took several seconds to remember. This wasn't a German camp. He wasn't on the front line. He was in Colorado, and he wasn't starving. He lay still a while, listening. No roll call scream, no booted officer pacing. Just the low murmur of men breathing, a snore, the soft thud of someone getting out of bed quietly. A camp orderly moved past the windows with a flashlight but didn't shine it in. No orders, no names barked, just routine. Emil sat up and found himself hoping there would be syrup again. They were marched to breakfast, if you could call it marching. It was more like walking in lines. The guards were there, of course, rifles slung lazily over shoulders, but their posture was almost relaxed. Some even waved. The snow from last night had frozen, crunching underfoot, and Emil could see his own breath curl into the pale morning air. In the mess, the same cook from yesterday greeted them with a wink. "Boys are getting oatmeal today," he said, "with cinnamon and raisins." Cinnamon, raisins. Emil couldn't even recall what cinnamon tasted like. He looked at his tray like it held treasure. Across from him, France was already eating, eyes wide. "You know what the guards said," he muttered between bites. "One of the other work details, the guys cleaning the city library, they were given donuts from the librarian." Emil blinked. Donuts. And coffee, American coffee. They ate in stunned silence. Even now there was suspicion. What if this was psychological warfare? What if the Americans were trying to make them feel shame, to humiliate them with kindness? Was that possible? Wouldn't pain have been easier? But there were no lectures, no propaganda films, no officers telling them they'd been lied to. There were just the days filled with quiet labor and small, bewildering kindnesses. That morning, Emil's work detail was redirected, not to the post office or the rail depot, but to a church. At first he thought it was a mistake. Churches in Germany had been dark, cold places. Only the very old still went, and even then they whispered their prayers as if someone might report them. But this was bright. Colorful glass windows, a bell tower, a white wooden steeple like something out of a painting. The American supervising them was young, barely 25, and introduced himself as Lieutenant Walter Hart, a former seminary student from Nebraska. His job today was to oversee the POWs as they painted the church's basement. "Pastor says the Christmas play's gonna be held down here," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "You boys up for some paintin'? It's warm down there, heat works fine." France leaned over and whispered, "They're letting us paint a church." The job wasn't hard. They were given clean overalls, brushes, and paint cans. A local handyman showed them what to do, then left them to it. No shouting, no inspections, just quiet work. And beneath the basement stairs, blankets, dozens of them, folded, ready. Emil saw them and asked. Lieutenant Hart looked over. Another guard told of how his own brother, a factory worker, regularly volunteered at soup kitchens even though he could barely afford meat once a week. "Kindness isn't weakness," Sergeant Whitaker said once, catching Emil staring. "It's damn hard, actually, harder than pulling a trigger." The final blow came that Sunday, when the POWs were allowed to attend a religious service, not because they were religious, but because it was optional. Some stayed behind. Emil went. The camp chapel was small, simple wooden benches, a cross, an organ, but the chaplain, a stern, sharp-jawed man in olive drab, preached not about victory, but about humility. "We are judged," he said, "not by how we treat the strong, but by how we treat the ones with nothing." And Emil felt something crack inside. When the service ended, Clara, the nurse from the shelter, approached him again. She handed him a small, folded piece of paper. Inside was a photograph. A man in a coat much like Emil's, holding a tin cup, smiling, standing beside a bakery. "Clarence," she said, "the man you saw last week, he died yesterday, pneumonia." Emil swallowed. I'm sorry." "He had nobody, but we tried. We gave him what we could. He was buried with a flag and a name. That's more than some get." She paused. "I thought you should know." Emil stared at the photo for a long time and realized this country, even in its poverty, even in its cracks, tried harder than any place he had ever known to remember that people were still people. Even beggars. Even enemies. Even him. December 15, 1944, Camp Trinidad. A week had passed since Emil Becker held the photograph of Clarence, the homeless man whose smile had haunted the edge of his memory. Since then, something inside him had changed. Not broken, shifted. Before, he had believed that survival was about obedience. That respect came from rank. That human worth was earned through service or sacrifice. But now he couldn't stop seeing the world through Clarence's eyes. A man discarded by society in Europe would have been spit on, hidden away, maybe even sent to labor camps. But here, in the very country Emil had been told was corrupted by capitalism and decadence, the man was not just tolerated. He was honored, buried with dignity. With a name. That morning the snow had finally eased, revealing a brilliant Colorado sky, so blue it looked artificial. The work detail assignments were posted early, and this time Emil's team was given something peculiar: community theater cleanup. France looked at the list and muttered, "Are they joking? Theater." But it was real. They were driven into town, past the courthouse and the school, to a two-story building with a marquee that read, "A Christmas Carol, December 23rd, all welcome." The guard escorting them, a lanky corporal named Hayes who walked like a cowboy and chewed sunflower seeds all day, pointed at the doors. "Inside, fellas, be polite. The director's a bit of a character." Inside smelled of dust and old wood, rows of red velvet seats, a stage with rickety scaffolding, and at the center of it all stood a whirlwind in tweed. Miss Dorothy Trammell, 60, gray-haired and armed with a clipboard like it was a weapon. "You the POW boys," she said without looking up. "Yes, ma'am," Emil answered cautiously. "Good, paint S over there, costumes are in a mess, props are late, the stage is a disaster, let's move." New Year's Day, 1945, Camp Trinidad, Colorado. The sky over the Rockies exploded with color as midnight fireworks burst in the town beyond the wire. Reds, whites, and golds reflected off the snowy slopes. The men in Barracks 3 gathered by the windows, wide-eyed, saying nothing. Emil Becker stood in the doorway, arms folded against the cold that seeped even through the steam pipes. He wasn't watching the fireworks. He was watching the guards. Corporal Hayes, Sergeant Whitaker, and 3 others had stepped out onto the yard, hats tipped back, grinning like schoolboys. One of them had brought out a battered phonograph and was spinning American jazz, something loud and brassy that made the very snow seem to dance. And when one of the guards looked up and noticed the German prisoners watching silently through the windows, he didn't wave them off. He waved them over. At first no one moved, even France hesitated. But then Weber, quiet, bookish Weber, the medic who never smiled, walked to the edge of the door, opened it, and stepped into the night. That was all it took. Within minutes, a dozen Germans stood at the fence, their breath fogging in the cold, watching the sky split open above the Colorado plains. And not a single rifle was raised. No warning shouted. No siren wailed. Only jazz. Only light. Only the sound of a country that celebrated even in the middle of war. Later that week, a notice was posted in the common room. The camp would begin offering vocational training programs, agriculture, carpentry, basic English, civics, optional again, always optional. But Emil signed up. So did France, and so did Weber, who volunteered to teach first aid to other prisoners. They stopped calling it re-education. It wasn't forced. There were no slogans, no flags, no lectures, just a chance to learn something useful to prepare for the world they might return to someday. One afternoon in early January, Emil sat in a wooden chair in a makeshift classroom, flipping through a worn English textbook when the teacher, a former professor from Denver, asked the class, "What does the word charity mean to you?" The room was silent. Then Han, the teacher who once snarled at everything American, raised his hand and said softly, "It means believing someone is worth helping, even when they can't repay you." The teacher smiled. "Very good, Mr. Han." That night, Emil wrote a letter, the first since his capture. He asked the Red Cross to send it through official channels. It was addressed to his sister in Hamburg. In it, he said nothing of war. He described the church basement, the woman who brought them coffee, the little boy who said, "Merry Christmas," the homeless man buried with a flag, and the American guard who said, "We don't throw people away." He ended the letter with a single line. If this is what defeat looks like, then perhaps what we called victory was never worth it. January 10, 1945, town of Trinidad. It was snowing again, soft and quiet. Emil stepped off the back of the truck, shovel in hand, as he and 4 other POWs prepared to help dig out the sidewalks around the library. 2 men walked by, locals, one in a fedora, the other in a heavy wool coat. One of them said to the other, "You know those German fellas, they work hard, never complain." The other nodded. Not all of them are bad, war's a mess, but people's still people. Emil pretended not to hear. But he did. That afternoon, while clearing snow near the back alley of the relief shelter, he found a man slumped against the bricks, Bare hands, bare feet, alive but barely. An American. Emil didn't think. He dropped the shovel, took off his own gloves, and shouted to Weber to get help. Minutes later, Clara arrived with 2 volunteers and a stretcher. As they carried the man away, she looked at Emil, her face tired. "Why did you help him?" He blinked. "Because someone helped me." She smiled just a little. "You've changed." "No," he said, "I've remembered." A pause. Remembered what? Emil looked up at the snow, falling slowly through the gray sky. That we are all capable of compassion. We just need to be shown. January 30, 1945, final work rotation before spring. Rumors had begun trickling through the grapevine. Germany was retreating. The Russians were pushing west. The Americans had liberated something in Poland, a camp of some kind. No one spoke of it directly, but the guards grew quieter. The tone changed. At dinner one night, Sergeant Whitaker sat with them. Not over them, with them. He cleared his throat, set down his coffee. "You boys are gonna see some hard news soon. Not just battles, but what was really happening back in Europe, what your leaders did." No one spoke. "I'm telling you now because I don't think you're those men. You can't unsee what's coming, but you can decide what kind of men you'll be when you go home." France looked up. "What if there's no home left?" Whitaker met his eyes. "Then maybe you build a better one." February 15, 1945, Camp Chapel. There was a new name etched into the memorial plaque near the chapel door. Clarence Lewis, 1881–1944. A man is more than his uniform, more than his past. A simple line. No rank, no unit, just a name and a truth. Weber placed a small wooden cross beneath it, hand-carved. Ms. Trammell, the theater director, had asked the camp to allow it. They had agreed. Later that day, Ms. Trammell delivered another envelope to Emil. Inside, a copy of the camp's theater program and a note. "If you ever find yourself near a stage again, remember, even ghosts can teach men to change. D.T." March 1945, Camp Trinidad. Spring came slowly. The snow melted, the days grew longer, and rumors turned to reports. Germany collapsing. Camps found. A world waking up from horror. And in the middle of it all, in a POW camp in Colorado, men who had once worn the swastika were writing letters home about kindness, about dignity, about the homeless man who received more grace in death than many soldiers had received in life. One day, a Red Cross package arrived addressed to Emil from his sister. Inside, a note. "The city is gone, the house is ash, but your letter was the first thing I have read that did not make me afraid of tomorrow. Thank you." May 1945, Germany surrenders. Camp Trinidad erupted in silence. There were no cheers. Just stunned quiet. And a deep, aching uncertainty. Some wept. Some prayed. Some simply stared at the floor. But the Americans didn't gloat. They didn't scream, "We won." Instead, the next morning, every POW was handed a hot breakfast, a newspaper, and a single stamped envelope blank with the words, "Write home, tell them who you are now." And that night, as Emil sat down with a pencil and trembling hand, he wrote, "I was once proud of a uniform. Now I am proud of what I learned when I had none. I was captured, yes. But in this place, in this strange, impossible place, I was also set free. Oh, those for the homeless. Pastor lets a few come in at night when it gets real cold. They sleep down here sometimes." Emil froze. "They sleep here." "Sure," Hart nodded. "Not every night, just the worst ones. We've got a soup kitchen up the road too, and the VFW sometimes brings coffee down when it snows heavy." France stepped closer. You shelter vagrants in a church. Hart looked confused. You'd rather they freeze. It wasn't sarcasm. It was genuine confusion. In Germany, a man without a job was seen as a burden, a failure, often a threat. In wartime, idle men were recruited or imprisoned. The idea that a homeless man could be helped, sheltered, fed without suspicion, without punishment, it didn't compute. That afternoon, Emil sat on the church steps, eating a sandwich one of the guards had handed him. Turkey, lettuce, real mayonnaise. A woman walked by and nodded politely, then glanced at the armband on his uniform. PW, prisoner of war. You boys doing okay? She asked. Emil nodded, too stunned to speak. I'm sorry you got caught up in all this, she said. War's a nasty thing. I lost my brother in France. I am sorry, Emil managed, unsure what else to say. She nodded. I hope you get home safe when it's all over. Then she walked on just like that. That night after lights out, France leaned over again in the dark. Back home, he whispered, do you remember when Private Kessler got frostbite in Stalingrad? Yes. Remember what the colonel said? Emil nodded slowly. He should have marched harder. France exhaled. I think I hate them for being decent, because it shows how indecent we became. The next morning, they were sent to work near the county hospital, a cleanup detail, hauling trash and sweeping ice from walkways. It was there that Emil saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A man, clearly a veteran, sat on a bench in a wheelchair, both legs gone. His uniform coat barely fit. The stumps were bandaged fresh. He had a thermos in his lap and a knit cap pulled down over one eye. A young nurse brought him a folded blanket, then gently tucked it around his legs. A group of schoolchildren passed. One boy stopped, pointed, and shouted, "He's a hero." The nurse smiled. The man nodded. He looked tired but not forgotten. In Germany, a crippled soldier was discarded, removed from the streets, sometimes even sent to institutions to keep the myth of strength intact. Here they gave him blankets and dignity. Emil could barely look. Later in the truck back to camp, he couldn't hold it in. Why, he said out loud, startling the other POWs. Why do they treat everyone like they matter? No one answered. Because none of them knew. That night, as a blizzard swept in over the Rockies, the guards passed out extra blankets. Sergeant Whitaker made a round through every barracks, checking the heaters, asking if any man was sick. You need something, just knock, he said to Emil personally. Don't be proud. It was too much. Emil waited until the lights dimmed and the other men were asleep. Then he sat up, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The snow was thick. A guard nodded at him from a tower but didn't stop him. Emil walked to the wire, the perimeter fence. He stood there for a long time, staring out into the whiteness. Then he whispered, "Did we lose the war before it even began?" He didn't expect an answer. But in that moment, watching snow fall quietly over the roofs of a prison camp kinder than his own country's barracks, he began to understand something painful. That the difference between a prison and a nation wasn't always the walls. It was how you treated the people inside. December 8, 1944, Camp Trinidad, Colorado, 5 days since the snowstorm and still no thaw. The wind howled like it was alive, crawling down from the mountains and pressing its weight into every crack of the wooden barracks. In Germany, this kind of cold meant death. Pipes froze, boots rotted from inside, and warmth was something you earned by obedience or rank. But in Camp Trinidad, every man had an extra blanket, 2 pairs of socks, and a working heater in the barracks. It had taken a week, but Emil stopped waiting for the whip to follow the sugar. Each morning began the same: coffee, food, work detail, but the illusion never cracked. There were no random beatings, no punishments for slouching, no forced confessions, and above all, no screaming. By now, Emil had memorized every face on his work team. France, the mechanic with soft hands and a steel spine. Dieter, a wiry farmer who rarely spoke. And Weber, a former medic who couldn't stop blinking at the strange humanity he kept encountering. There were a dozen others, but it was those three who stuck together, whispering at night and keeping track of what they saw. Today, the assignment was something new. The truck didn't head toward the rail yard or the church or the post office. It turned instead toward the edge of town, where squat buildings gave way to scrubland and distant snow-capped buttes. It was a relief shelter. The sign out front read, TRINIDAD Municipal Relief Center, WPAFUNDED, all welcome. Lieutenant Hart hopped down from the cab and waved the POWs out. All right, fellas, this one's different. We're setting up cots and unloading supplies. There's a train coming in tonight. Some folks from further west got displaced by the last storm. No questions, just kindness. Got it. They nodded. Inside, the building was cavernous. A former armory now turned into something strange, a halfway place. Beds were lined in neat rows, with stacks of folded wool blankets beside each. Cardboard boxes filled with canned peaches, beans, saltine crackers. Crates labeled medical, sterile gauze, and clothing donated. Emil blinked. These weren't soldiers they were preparing for. These weren't even prisoners. These were American civilians, refugees of weather, of poverty, of bad luck, and they were being treated with organization and dignity. He grabbed a box of blankets and began walking. In the center of the room, a black woman in a green nurse's uniform greeted him in clean, practiced German. Dank für Ihr Hilfe, she said. Ich heiße Clara, ich war in Berlin vor dem Krieg. Emil froze, Sie sprechen Deutsch. Clara smiled. Yes, studied there before Hitler made it hard for people like me to stay. He nodded slowly, watching her move through the center with calm authority, directing guards and prisoners alike. That afternoon, the first arrivals came. Women with children wrapped in every layer they owned. Elderly men coughing into cloths. Young men with missing fingers, old miners, war widows, and drunkards with trembling hands. And the Germans watched. Watched as Clara gave every one of them a hot meal. Watched as Lieutenant Hart helped a man into a cot. Watched as American volunteers handed out new socks, cocoa, soup, all without judgment. No one screamed. No one laughed. No one accused. At one point, a young boy no more than 7 wandered too close to the POW work group. He looked at Emil, tilted his head, and asked in perfect English, "Are you one of the bad guys?" Before Emil could answer, his mother appeared and pulled him away gently, but she didn't look at Emil with hatred, only pity. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And Emil felt something sour rise in his throat. Later, while stacking crates of apples, Weber approached with a question no one had dared ask out loud yet. Do you think our side would have done this?" Emil didn't answer. Because they both knew the answer. Germany did not make room for the weak, for the broken. Germany had one place for them, out of sight, out of mind, or worse. But here they sheltered them. After sundown, the relief shelter was full. The lights buzzed. The smell of disinfectant and soup filled the air, and the guards let the Germans eat a second meal before returning to camp, a reward for the extra hours. One POW, a former teacher named Han, said it aloud over the bread roll in his hand. "I used to think discipline was strength, but now I think compassion might be." No one argued. Back at camp, rumors began spreading, not of war, but of ideas. Word filtered in from other camps. German prisoners in Alabama had been allowed to organize a choir. Others in Wyoming had watched American movies, even comedies. Some in Texas were working on cattle ranches and were being taught how to ride horses. But the story that struck the hardest came 2 days later. The Red Cross liaison arrived with 2 American officers in tow. Once inside the main barracks, They unrolled a set of posters for the men to read, written in both English and German. It was a call for volunteers. America was seeking educated prisoners, men with teaching backgrounds or engineering skills or language fluency, to help teach new recruits and even fellow prisoners, not as propaganda, but as education. Emil stared at the leaflet like it was a hallucination. France stepped forward. "Wait, they want us to teach us." One of the American officers spoke slowly in German. "This is optional. No bribes, no threats, but you'll be helping your countrymen. We know not all of you are Nazis. We treat you as human because we believe in that even now." Even now. Even after U-boats sank hospital ships, even after the Ardennes offensive had begun, even after the camps were discovered in Poland. They still believed in treating prisoners with dignity. Emil couldn't sleep that night. In the bunk below, France muttered something Emil couldn't quite catch. "What?" he whispered. "I keep thinking of my uncle," France repeated. "He was turned away from a food line in Hamburg because he'd lost his ID papers. 2 days later, he was found dead in the canal. And these Americans, they hand sandwiches to men on sidewalks." There were stories every day now. One guard confessed that he'd seen a man arrested in Chicago for stealing a loaf of bread, only for the judge to sentence him to community service and pay the bakery out of his own pocket.